Hi, everyone. This is Chris Schweitzer, and I am talking today with Athens, Georgia's Patrick Dean.
How are you?
Are you talking to me or the audience?
Oh, the audience, I guess.
Okay. Patrick is the cartoonist behind Big Deal Comics and Stories, one of the most consistently spectacular short form comic anthologies in which he published. I'm trying to remember the early issues, but for at least the recent issues, each installment of Big Deal is one story. Is that the
The
way it's always been?
the first five, I think the first nine issues were all reprints from the Flagpole comics that I used to do for Flagpole magazine here in Athens, Georgia.
Really? I did not know that.
I printed up, I think the first two or three issues. I went to a copy shop here in town, and some of the comics that I had been doing for Flagpole since 1997. I just went in there and bundled them together, little 24-page comics, digest sized, and just ran them. I think I ran off like 100 all at one time, and that was at the time when the only comic conventions I went to were Fluke, and that was it.
Yeah.
And so, other than that, I didn't have a website at the time, so it took me, oh gosh, like 6 or 7 years to to sell through like 100 copies of those books. And I think
Now,
once they sold out, I never reprinted them again. And so those were all
ooh,
out of print. But by out of print means I'm just too lazy to go back to the copy shop and run them off. And I'm not
yeah.
sure if anyone wants to see my comics from the late '90s.
I'm in the same boat. I don't reprint many comics, mostly because of the effort involved in them. I used to be a
Sure.
lot more fancy with my production concerns, and I'm not anymore. I also no longer have access to copy machines, printers, things like that for free the way that I did when I was at the school. So that cuts into my willingness to do so considerably.
Everything I did was pretty much just like digest size, staple in half, fold in half, and like that. And like that was like to the extent of my production cost. One of the first mini comics I saw of yours was the one about you shaving your mustache.
That was the first one that I did. That's the first one everybody saw. I think I gave that one to everybody.
Yeah.
Um, which I'm glad. I think it's the best comic I ever did. Now you mentioned Fluke. Now, if a lot of people may not know Fluke because it's a regional show, but it's a really great regional show.
Oh, thank you.
Were you involved in its beginnings?
No, actually, Todd Bach was the creator of Fluke. It was, and actually, it's all because of 9/11. Originally, when 9/11 came up, it was SPX was coming up that fall,
Mhm.
and because of 9/11, it was that year SPX was canceled out there,
But
and
everyone had
so
already. It was close enough that everyone had already printed up their mini comics and things like that.
yeah, I think it was like in October or something like that, or like early. Wow, that train, that's amazing.
Yeah, sorry, I live right by the tracks,
That's
so.
wonderful. Looky, my brother used to live near train tracks out in Celanese, near Rome, Georgia, and he said it was like a church organ coming by your window, and it was just it's wonderful to fall asleep to.
It's kind of neat. Penny actually, we were worried that it might keep her up or something like that. It doesn't. Like when we're sleeping, we don't notice it. But anytime the train whistle comes, and the train comes by about every half hour, she gets really excited and she runs to the windows. We have a window on
Oh,
each
that's
side.
great.
We have the building stretches from the front of the building to the back of the building is where our
Yeah.
apartment goes. And so she'll run to one window or the other and try to spot the engine before it passes. And luckily it's loud and they blare for a long time before they get here. So she usually has plenty of time. Most of the time it's not bad, except around like 1 o'clock in the morning. There's one guy who goes through, because they're usually going through pretty quick. There's one guy who goes through at probably about 4 miles an hour, and he just lays on the horn for about a mile straight. So
I
if
guess
you're
it has
awake, it's kind of
a
obnoxious.
cars.
But it's just the CSX line that runs through, and it's fun. It's one of the charming things of living in a downtown, old downtown. But
Oh,
you were saying with
oh,
with SPX, so SPX was coming up, but it was canceled.
right. So with 9/11 having canceled SPX that year, Todd Bach came in and started Fluke, and I think that was then. I think it was right after SPX then. And so, or like it was around the time when SPX was going on, and so would have been going on, and so he had announced something a few months after around that time that he would try to make a his own mini comics convention here in Athens, Georgia. And the first year, that was in
No,
2002.
I don't know if I know Todd. Is he an Athens local?
He was, yeah, Todd Bach. He did.
I feel like I know the name.
He did a book recently for oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the name of the company that did it. It was called The Island of Memory.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
And Floating World Comics.
In my mind, I was mistaking him with T. Edward Bach. Is that his name?
I'm sorry. Yes, T. Edward Bach. Yes. That's what he usually goes by.
So that is the same guy. Okay.
Yeah, it is the same guy. And,
I didn't know he was in Athens.
Well, he lived in Athens like in the late '90s, early 2000s, and then he moved up to like out west.
Okay.
Up in the Pacific Northwest. But he had so he started up the first Fluke in 2002, and the first year we had it at did you come to Fluke when it was at the upstairs Tasty World area?
Yes, I did.
Yes. Okay, that was where it originally was, and the first year I think 40 people showed up. And we made flyers, and we had a little like a book that went along with it. And that first year, it was such a weird little like, let's just see what happens, kind of thing. And so I think the second year, he was planning on moving up north. And so me, Robert Newsom, and I kind of took over some of the administrative stuff with that. And by that point, he was getting ready to move up north anyway. And so the third year, Robert and I took it over after he left town.
Okay.
And we continued it from there. So.
And Fluke it's really a charming show. It's a like a mini comics and zine. I call it almost more a trade show than a convention because
it is. We always try to point out the fact that if you come to this, it's both it's both major publishers. Like we have like Top Shelf has been like one of our sponsors since day one.
Mm-hmm. And I've seen Ad House there before.
Ad House, Floating World was there last year, but we also, because we only charge $15 for a table, that way anybody who's like has published like books by major publishers and so forth can be there, but also SCAD students who want a table for the first time can get their feet wet there.
So many it's so many people's first shows I found, and it's also it's easily I think the most democratic show that I've ever been to.
Yes,
I think that like there are other shows that sort of encourage that amateur or new person doing it for fun mentality. Like Space does that, but Space is also kind of lacking in a lot of professional presence, I think.
Right.
And so it's really interesting in that you have many of like the best cartoonists of the Southeast tabling at the show next to an 18-year-old who it's their very first time to go out and they have like one mini comic, and that to me is really awesome. And the fact that there doesn't seem to be any hierarchy there. Everybody is very open to these new guys coming in, and it's really a great atmosphere.
Thank you. I mean, yeah, we pretty much wanted to set it up like that, and we've pretty much dug our heels into keeping it that way. Like we've had to move away from the other place because, well, for one thing, we were about to outgrow it, but also around the time too, that bar became a restaurant. It became like an upscale southern kind of Applebee's-ish kind of restaurant,
which is a different vibe, I guess.
Yeah, so we can't have it there, and so. And from what I hear, the bartenders actually found out that the place had been sold from other people. Like they had said, "Oh, I heard y'all don't have a job anymore."
Oh.
And so they had heard about it on the streets, and then we heard about it, and so that's when we moved from there to Cine, which is kind of across the street-ish or one street over from the 40 Watt. Mm-hmm. And that first year we outgrew it like that area immediately. Then we moved to the 40 Watt. The 40 Watt seems to be like the perfect spot for that. Because if it was any bigger, we would have to go to a hotel where we would have this big, large, also alcohol-free atmosphere. And I think having it in a bar where you can start selling minis and order a whiskey sour at 11 a.m. I mean,
there's something really charming about that. Like I really like that it's actually in the bar. It's also good. It's also good. It was really good for the students. a number of whom I think who would go and who would set up either as attendees or as exhibitors. Um, I think that if some of these kids who are raised in like a teetotaler atmosphere are really concerned that if they're somewhere with drinking that they'll be like really, I don't know, like pressured into participating.
Right.
And so they're really nervous about shows like Heroes and things like that, where everybody hangs out at the bar afterwards, and that's where all of the, all of the networking is done. And so Fluke is a great way of seeing that that's not the case. That
We've never had anybody be sloppy drunk or anything there.
no, and I think it's a great way of sort of having a sort of a safe daytime environment where they can see
Sure.
that that's not going to be the case. Um,
And because this is the 40 Watt Club, they are razor sharp, strict about anyone sneaking in or trying to get like someone under 21 trying to get a drink.
yeah,
They put the kibosh on that like that.
yeah,
They've never had anything where someone's been out of control and that sort of thing. Plus, they also have a giant water cooler there for people who just want a cup of water. They have
yeah.
plastic cups or paper cups and a huge water jug there with for no charge. They just can get a cup of water and Cokes and that sort of thing. And actually, last year was the first year that Robert and I used the Fluke funds to buy an enormous cake, which fed 96. The people at Kroger said, yes, this cake will feed 96 people, and we were out exactly 96 plates, and we were amazed at how precise that was.
That is pretty amazing. I'm impressed. When I first went to Fluke when it was at not at the 40 Watt at Tasty World.
Tasty World. Which was apparently the name of was apparently the name of a music magazine in Athens, Georgia, in the early '80s.
Oh, okay.
And so when it opened up, like in the mid '90s, I had just turned 21, and I remember the first week it opened up, they had like bowls of goldfish crackers everywhere, and I thought that was kind of charming. But even then, like I had to ask my older brother, like, what does Tasty World mean? That doesn't make a lick of sense.
Yeah. Now how did you find yourself in Athens? Are you from Athens originally?
No, I'm from Rome, Georgia, which is about a 2-hour northwest drive, up from Atlanta, and my older brother went to UGA, and I kind of fell in love with the town there when we come to visit him, and so right after high school, I was trying to get into SCAD in Atlanta, and once
You mean in Savannah?
no, I'm sorry, not SCAD. It was the Atlanta College of Art. I mean,
Oh, gotcha. Yeah,
right.
yeah.
And I think with
It's
that,
SCAD now. They combined
it's
a few
SCAD
years
now.
ago. Yeah.
But then we just realized, like, my family was like, we can't afford to go to this place, and so because it was too late to get into the fall quarter of UGA, I wound up going to a community college in Rome, Georgia, for 2 quarters, and once I was accepted for the spring quarter of my freshman year is when I came over to Athens, and I just fell in love with the town. I mean, again, like it really was like I love this place, and so after college, I had friends from Atlanta who moved back to Atlanta to get better jobs, and I just stuck around this place just because I just loved it too much, I guess. And
It's a great town. I mean, like I assume the college atmosphere keeps a lot of cultural things happening. I mean, you guys have a great music scene, you've got a good theater scene, and so, and the town itself is just so charming. Like the downtown area is just a great walking area.
it is, yeah. Within the 4 or 5 blocks of like that little downtown area, there's all kinds of like shops and restaurants, and also it's just kind of affordable too. I mean, like the when I was living here, I was like, okay, the rent here is cheap, food here is cheap. We have a really wonderful comic shop in downtown Athens, Bizarre Luxury,
Mm-hmm.
and I think Bizarre Luxury kind of ruins me on other comic shops.
That's fair. It's a good comic shop. It's easy to get ruined on a comic shop by a good one because so few are as good as they could be.
Sure, sure. I mean, Devlin brings in all kinds of really old comics, and he also like he also stocks like really old 70s Fireside hardback books, in all kinds of conditions, and he prices them fairly reasonably.
Oh yeah, I found all sorts of like Toth Jesse Bravo stuff there. I mean, like he'll just have the stuff that he keeps that's old. He keeps because it's good. It's not like just random back issues of stuff. It's he keeps things that somebody is going to want, and there's something kind of pretty amazing about that.
He's got a copy of the Mobius Airtight Garage right now,
Oh, cool.
and but he's seen it go for like $200 online, and so he's priced it at about 120. But he's also kind of in that, like, if anyone wants to make a deal on it, I will.
Yeah.
But it's a wanted item right now. But he also tells people, I've seen him talk to people books that they want to buy, saying, "Look, this might come back in a print about 4 years, so hold on."
Yeah. There's he also, one thing that kind of struck me, the first experience I had with Devlin and with Bizarro Wuxtry, was that he would buy mini comics from exhibitors after the show,
Oh,
including
right.
these kids. And I mean, like, and it's stuff that probably a lot of it he knows he's not going to sell. And I think he does it out of solidarity, maybe.
Sure, sure, absolutely.
And he'll give, store credit or cash, and so the kids get super excited because the store just bought their first mini comic. It's
Sure.
really it's a pretty amazing experience, I think.
Yeah, I remember, like, even like in the mid '90s, he had like a zine and self-published mini comic section, and so he would have, like, I remember seeing one of John L. Helsing's books there, and a bunch of other just kind of oddball books from, whoever was publishing comics or doing mini comics in Athens, Georgia. He would have like a little section for that, and actually in his store he has a Athens Atlanta comics rack where it's Drew and Eleanor's, Joey, some of my stuff, and just anyone else there who collects their stuff and puts it in like a mini comic. He has it there, like in this little special, like, local area.
That is so cool. That's really neat. Now with so you would contribute to the Fluke anthologies, which was
Right.
was part of Fluke from the first year, you said?
Yeah, the first years we were trying to find out the cheapest ways to Xerox off. Like, I think the first year we did it, Devlin Thompson saw over the production of it, and so it was this crazy complicated thing where you had like a bunch of slightly oversized digest manila folders, and I think all of the covers were screen printed, and some of the pages were printed on like regular paper, some of them were printed on newsprint, and each one of them had a little small envelope that was like sealed in wax that had oh gosh, Devlin had done this like book called like Tales of the Web Beat Fiend, and it was like a Windsor McKay Tales of the Rabbit Fiend comic, only it was only it was like Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd. It was drawn in that style. He had it printed on like a piece of newsprint and then folded up and crumpled down and shoved in the envelope, like it was like something you would find like pressed in between the pages of a book.
Mm-hmm.
And each of those was like glued onto the inside of that book. And so,
Oh.
and I think another book, I think each one came with a small mini that was like plastic paper tagged onto like, or plastic tagged onto like each thing. So each book had these crazy production values, but we only made like 40 of them.
The 2000s were just this period of insanely complicated mini comics. I don't know. Do people still do that? I haven't been to SPX in a while, so I haven't seen
I think
what's being done. But for a while there was, and some of you Athens guys were leading the charge on that. I think like Beast Mother springs to mind, and then
oh gosh, yes, I cherish that book.
oh, it's good. That and Blah are still two of my very favorite mini comics that I've ever gotten.
She did another book. She did another mini. Eleanor Davis did one called I think it's called Where Are My Dots?
I don't know if I have that one.
I think she made like it was in full color, and like every page you turn, and like this guy's trying to find his dots or something, and like every page you turn, it turns into to a different thing. But I think she made like maybe 50 of them or something, and once it dropped off, we never saw it again. Actually, Eleanor was in the second or third Fluke book when she was still a SCAD student, and she had a story in there about a scientist giving like his girlfriend like a giant robot.
Oh man, I don't have that one. I feel like in general, I'm kind of an Eleanor completist, and I've tracked down as much as I can, but I haven't read that one.
Well, I mentioned before her book came out, I joked her like, "Oh, is that going to come out?" And her face just furrowed like, "No, no one's ever going to see that again."
Yeah, I asked her the first one before I ever met her. I read one that she had in a SCAD anthology, that one with the desert island and the people Merging Languages. Do you remember that one?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
so good. I ended up getting rid of the anthology just because I didn't have the shelf space. But somebody on Twitter suggested just cut out the stories that you like, and I was like, that's terrible, but I'm going to. So I have a folder of like paperback anthology stories that I've just like exacto knifed out of the books, and that one's in there.
I heard that's what Wally Wood did with his EC books, like all
Oh,
the
the
EC.
stories he liked, he would just
Yeah, yeah, he would just like, or like his stories to have them on file. He would just like rip the pages out and I put them in a file on that. There you go.
there you go. It's not a bad plan. Now you with your comics, and one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you this month rather than later on down the road, although from when I first thought about starting to do this, you always kind of were very near the top of the list of people that I wanted to talk to. Um, uh, it's October, and you're a big Halloween buff. I'm a big
I,
Halloween buff too, but I think of you as being the biggest Halloween buff I know.
well, thank you. I just there's something about this month. I think it's a combination of just the temperature changing. Like I swear, like on October 1st, everything went from like we had these nice like 80-degree weekends to
Mhm.
suddenly it was in the 60s and like the upper 40s at night.
Yeah,
And I was just like,
I
ah,
love that. I keep my windows open now that it's like 50 degrees.
we're opening all of our windows like in the afternoons and that
Mhm.
sort of thing, and I'm like, oh, I got to bring all my sweaters. I bought the most ridiculous sweater yesterday at a thrift store, and it looks like something from like the 1920s. It's got like it's this big heavy sweater. It's silk lined. It's got this like weird eagle thing on the chest, part of its brown turtleneck. It's got leather bands on like the bottom and the top and a zipper. It looks like I don't know.
That's pretty. I'm a sucker for overly complicated old timey sweaters. So
I'm
you've
pretty
got my vote on that sweater's okay.
I don't believe I'll be able to wear it until like when it gets like in like the 30s or 40s and so forth, because
Yeah.
or else I'll look like a crazy person. But so yeah, so Halloween comes around and I get really excited, and so just right then, like I put aside everything I'm reading, and I turn it all into like if it's not a ghost story, it doesn't involve monsters, I'm not going to read it. And so
That's my way too. From like honestly, and I give myself I don't watch or read any horror stuff for pretty much the entire year, so that I can save it up and binge on it in September and October.
there's certain books that I buy like in the summertime where like I can't read this book and it's 90 degrees outside. You know? I read an Algernon Blackwood horse, ghost story when it's like 90 degrees and you're wearing shorts, and it's humid. Maybe there are certain kind of like weird Southern horror humid stories that are applicable to read in that weather, but for the most part, it's mostly sweater weather when it comes to this stuff. Like right now, next to my table, I'm reading all of the Tomb of Dracula stuff.
Mhm.
Which man, Gene Colan did not screw around. I just love like every page that he drew in that book.
I've never read any Tomb of Dracula. I haven't read most of that's one of the DC horrors, right?
Oh, that's Marvel.
Oh,
It's
the Tomb of Dracula is Marvel. Okay.
yeah, Tomb of Dracula is Marvel, and that was the one that I think the first like 4 or 5 issues had like different writers like Archie Goodwin. I think who else like other people just like wrote the first like 3 or 4 issues, and then it became Marv Wolfman and Gene Colan throughout the entire 70 issues. But I think it was one big long self-contained story, and so like Iron Man didn't pop up and that sort of thing throughout all the Iron Man. I mean throughout all the Tomb of Dracula issues, and then I think by issue 70 came around, they were able to like wrap up the story, and so it became this one long like continuous self-contained thing versus. And then the thing shows up.
Yeah.
That,
Would you recommend reading it in black and white or in color?
and black and white, definitely. I
Okay.
mean, Rich Tomasa said that he looked at one of the big Tomb of Dracula omnibuses that came out recently,
Yeah.
and the way they colored it, all the colors were just so saturated, and it was like yellow, red, and blue that it just like it just took away from all of like Gene Colan's like beautiful line work.
Yeah.
Gene Colan has this really wispy line to it. And these big, heavy blacks and shadows to it. And
Yeah.
so, but the sad thing about that though is the first two are out of print, and so I wound up like finding like the first three on eBay for like $40,
Yeah. Ugh.
and I was like biting my nails like, should I like go for more than that? What
Well,
the
they're probably not going to reprint them that way again. Like I feel like those newsprint ones, they feel like once and done print runs.
They do, they do.
Because I've never seen those early ones for any of them pop up again in the things. I think it was like an experiment to see whether or not that was working. But I think it was a great experiment because you get all of these great. If you're, I mean, I was thinking they'd be good gifts for kids and stuff like that. But really,
Sure.
if you want to give a kid the first 20 issues of Spider-Man, you should probably give it to him in color. But if you're wanting to learn from seeing what these artists did, looking at them in the black and white version is
That's why I
incredible.
love that format. I mean, most of the things that I have reprint wise are if I can find it in the black and white. Some of the production values are really good on these. Like I have the two Jonah Hex ones from DC,
Mm-hmm.
and some of that stuff with all the Filipino artists look amazing. I mean, that stuff in black and white looks just crystal clear and sharp. But
Yeah.
I'd rather have that stuff in black and white than color for the most part. And actually, I think the Spider-Man stuff looks good in color. But to be honest, those first 38 issues that Ditko did would look really nice in black and white
Oh,
too.
they look great in black and white. He
You
had
could-
just really nice, like black on white, white on black layering that I think he just did a spectacular job with. And I never really liked Kubert all that much until I started seeing his stuff in black and white. And I got the Enemy Ace book, and it's one of the most beautifully drawn books I've ever seen. But I think so much of the Kubert color that I saw was like 90s color with like a lot of airbrush in it, and it just really took away from the how simple and effective his aesthetic was.
Yeah, I remember. I had a friend who would who would advise me like, look, if you're going to buy a reprint of this book, don't get this edition. If you're going to get a reprint of this book, stay away from this edition. They do airbrush coloring. They go a little bit overboard with like the digital coloring, and it looks terrible. So
yeah, well, I kind of liked the you mentioned Rich and the being flustered with the colors. Rich did such a great job on the Uncle Scrooge ones that.
Oh yeah,
I can't imagine how hard it must be for him to look at some of these other things. Even if you just like did like even if you weren't recoloring, but you're just pulling down the saturation a little bit. Like one of my very favorite comic runs of anything ever are the old, like the first however many issues of the Marvel Further Adventures of Indiana Jones. I mean, like the art is kind of hit or miss depending on who it is, but the stories are all like really well done and solid and self-contained, or like 2-issue cliffhangers. But when Dark Horse put out the collection version of that, like Indiana Jones's hat and jacket are like Spider-Man red. And I feel like it would not have been that hard to just do like a batch edit and just like desaturate and like up the yellow and red on everything just a little bit.
I heard they did that with the Conan books, because when they started reprinting the Conan books from Marvel, there were like, I think there was like one panel in particular that Barry Windsor Smith did. They're pointing at something saying, "They're across the river," and the original coloring, they just made everything green. And so it was like a big field, and so when Dark Horse went back and reprinted that, they had to go, make that blue like a river or something. The thing that he's pointing at, calling it a river, don't paint it green like everything else.
Yeah. And those EC war books that came out where they the EC anything books, like
the archives,
where they would go in and like the things that, especially the Kurtzman like micromanaged war stories, where it would be like inside a plane, and it would just be like the whole page would be red like from beginning to end because he was trying to push that, and they go in and do everything in like local color, and there's like fuzzy thing, and it pulled away from the original intention so much as to be kind of shocking.
The sounds of those were those individual comic reprints that they were doing, like in the late '90s, I think it was, or the mid '90s. Like you can find this for about $1 a piece. Those hardcover ones where they color everything, and I think it was Marie Severin working on those, but giving her different guidelines, and I really prefer just like the big solid.
Yeah.
Actually, when they reprinted there was a printing of the Fantastic Four first like 10 or so issues, and one of the reprintings of that, they colored them like they originally were originally colored, and so some panels were just like solid yellow figure, red background. solid
Yeah.
green figure, blue background, as opposed to just everything being like individually colored. And I kind of like that.
I like that too. I think it can make it pop. It's something that is very hard for me to do with my own stuff,
Sure.
just because it requires such gutsiness. Um, and I'm just not that brave to move. I'm trying to move in that direction. So in the creeps, I've got a number of scenes in which like the scene is purple and the characters are orange or something.
Yeah,
Um,
I've seen some of the pages you put up on Tumblr and Facebook, saying like, here it is with these kind of colors, here it is with cool colors, here it is with warm colors, and yeah, I definitely like that. Just simpler the better. I mean, what is it? Is it Dave Stewart, the guy who colors a lot of the Hellboy stuff?
yeah,
It's funny because when he came out, when he was doing stuff, it was so, I don't want to say simple, but he was doing everything flat and letting that stuff pop on its own.
yeah.
That it was funny. People were going, "Oh my gosh, it's so amazing and revolutionary." It's just, but it's funny that it's just him saying less is better. Just let the stuff work on its own, as opposed to having. I mean, I go crazy when I see line art for some of these books where the inker is just saying, the colorist will make this grass. I'm not going to draw grass because the colorist will do it.
Oh,
I don't. I
yeah.
don't draw
That's
clouds. Let the colorist draw clouds. I saw a
oh, you're making my stomach drop out.
Igor Kordy, the guy who he's Croatian.
The
He
name sounds familiar, but I can't place it.
he did a book called Smoke with Darko Makan, but he did a small run of cable comics
Hmm.
in like the early 2000s, where he's a really great illustrator, but he did these very meaty, almost Corbinish looking figures. And I saw some like original artwork of his where he drew a character like flying in the air, clutching onto somebody, and he drew like the sky, and he drew the clouds, and like he drew the landscape underneath it. And then at some point, you saw where the colors went back, and just deleted like all the colors, like all the clouds that he had drawn. It just stretched a photograph of
Oh,
clouds, and it was just like, damn it, the guy drew really nice clouds. Just
yeah.
let that.
Oh, I in any of that sort of thing, and it's I tend to go back and forth with the acceptability of fonts or text for things like signs or newspapers or something.
Sure, sure, sure.
But I think, have you read Southern Bastards?
No, I haven't, but like I've seen some of the pages or like on previewed on CBR on
Hmm.
comic resources, and it's really nice. It's really it looks great.
Well,
That's Rico, right?
yeah, that's Rico.
Yes. Okay.
And I think they do. I think that's one of the few that I've seen that does a really good job incorporating it in as a graphic element,
Sure.
where it doesn't feel like it feels like it's okay that it's in there. It doesn't feel like a cheat. It feels like a conscious artistic decision as opposed to I can't draw a sign.
Sure.
Um,
Sure.
so I don't know, but I also feel like some of the stuff that's like in neon or things or stuff that's drawn and then tweaked to look a
I mean,
certain way. Um,
I've gone back and redrawn panels. Like I think when I first started, like there was a comic that I serialized in Flagpole magazine called Eddie's Week. No, I'm
mhm.
sorry, called Eddie Goes to Portland, and it ran on for like 30 something weeks. And there was in one of the stories he's reading a Life magazine, and at that time it was late 90s, and I had a computer, and I was like, ooh, instead of having him, instead of drawing a Life magazine, I just found a Life magazine and dropped it in there.
Mhm.
And when I collected it in like the book or whatever, I was like, I actually had an apology. I was like, you know what? I should. It was better for me to have drawn like just like a Life magazine cover than for me to just pull it off of Google and just bloop, drop it in there. It
Yeah.
looked terrible. And also in that same thing, and I did that awful sin where I drew a building, and this is like me confessing something terrible.
You copied and pasted the windows.
No, I did a brick texture. Instead of just drawing some damn bricks, instead of
Yeah.
just drawing some lines and making a brick texture, I made like a gray and I did that brick texture. Bloop! It's the bricks.
We're all there were I think all of us have shameful confessions in that same vein. And I think that's okay. I'm doing I'm doing some animation work. I'm doing some like pre-production stuff, designing backgrounds that
Oh,
modelers are
oh,
using, and it's something where I'm taking a while on them, more for schedule than the execution of the actual art. But the art takes a while, and the revisions especially take forever because it's animation. There are a lot of revisions, and so I have to go in and redraw everything. And the art director's like, it's okay to put in a stone wall texture here, and here are some line drawings of some regional trees you can put in the background. And I'm just like, it feels to me like it's like clubbing baby seals. It seems just. I know that nobody is going to see this art except for like the art director and the modelers that are going to be using it as a guide for the model. But I still, in my mind, like I want anything that I do professionally that gets out to be indicative of what I do, so that if
when someone sees that original art, you want them to go, oh, he did this and this, versus, oh, he relied on this.
Yeah, and it's okay. And the thing is, artists that I really love, I don't judge them when I see them do that.
Sure.
In a pre-production setting, like if they're doing something that's not intended for publication, if it's intended for publication, that's different.
Sure.
And then I judge them very harshly. But when it's done for like pre-production things or something like that, I could care less, and I'm like, oh, okay, I see what that means. And if I were doing something for somebody else, and I'm working with an artist on a project, and I'll do this, I'll send him with the script. I'll just have like a photo of something and something drawn on top of it or whatever it might be, just to give an indication of what it is. And it doesn't feel like that's a problem, but for some reason, because, and this is just, it just proves that I'm an amateur, I can't get past the stumbling block of that this is a piece of art that I'm being paid for. It's got to be representational of what I can do.
Well, when you sell your originals, you also want those originals to look nice and presentable.
Except I'm doing these digitally, so I don't even have originals. It's just ego. I just need to get over it.
Did you read the Cold Crew book I did? The only time I did a part in that where I had to like copy panels was there's 3 panels in a row where someone leads someone into a room, shoots them in the back, and walks off. And so I had these 3 panels where someone walks off, and then like a little blood comes out of the doorway.
I didn't notice that was copied. Did you just copy the pencils and then re-ink them, or did you just straight up copy the?
I did one panel and then just kind of copy pasted like 2 of those panels because it's like 3. There's 3 at the top, and so in the original artwork there's like 1 panel and then like 1 extra panel with without that character, and then him pasted in there, and so that 1 page looks like his. I did the whole book in like 9-panel grids after looking at all this like all the Ditko Spider-Man stuff, and I saw how well all that stuff looked good in 9-panel grids, so I thought I'd do the whole thing in 9 panels, but that 1 page has just 3 panels that has like 1 panel at the top with like a few little sketches and so forth, and I'm like, screw it.
I wanna say that I think it is a testament to the quality of your storytelling that I never noticed the formalist stuff in that story. I never noticed that you were doing it on a 9-panel grid.
It was kind of like a weird little straitjacket that I just had to put myself into. Like, okay, well then, it looks so good when other people do these like nice 9-panel grid books in the '60s. How can I do it? Because some things you see where I understand why some people do this, but every once in a while you'll see a book where I don't want everything to be a 9-panel grid, but sometimes you see things where I'm surprised when people put like 2 or 3 sentences per page, and they have to make everything look like a panoramic. I give everything a panoramic view, where everything doesn't need like the pacing of the story doesn't need like a panoramic, 3 panels on every single page. It's not. It's not like a wide length movie. It's not like a letterbox movie. It's a comic, and so when someone does these pages where it's like 3
like Scott Morrissey type stuff where it's like the same widescreen format, like.
Yeah, but it's someone just saying, "Oh, really?" and like looking kind of surprised. There's no buildup or tension there at all.
Yeah.
So.
Well, it's I mention it because I just read Cold Crew. I read both the things that I got from you at Heroes sort of in preparation for this. I'd put all my Heroes stuff in a box because I was moving right after, and I just had forgotten to get it out. And yeah, a lot of times if there is some sort of structure to the way that the comic is done, I like to think that I pick up on it. I'm like, oh, okay, so he's doing a 9-panel grid, and it never occurred to me, and I think that that's just because your command of the propulsion of the narrative was really strong in that one.
Oh, thank you.
With Cold Crew, you've so far as your tweets and Facebook posts and things like that goes, you've got a lot of a propensity for sort of straight genre fiction, crime and horror especially.
Sure.
But your comics rarely venture into those arenas. Your comics, to at least the ones that I've read and that I can remember, most of them feel more along the lines of I don't. They're very difficult for me to describe to people, and that bugs me. I wish you were more easily categorizable.
I always feel bad when someone says, "What kind of comics do you do?" And I kind of start babbling because I don't want to make it sound like I've created a new genre of comics.
Well,
it's like when you ask someone like, "Oh, what's your band sound like?" and they say, "I can't describe it." The first reaction is like, "Oh, come on, is it like Roxy Music meets Steely Dan? Is it like the Replacements? Is it what?" And when they say, "No, really, I can't describe it," I'm like, ah. But then I understand that now when someone says, "Oh, I wanted to look like 70s Charlton horror comics meets Love and Rockets," and you think that's the worst description in the world. I'd be embarrassed to say that out loud.
Well, no, they feel to me they're too, and it's weird because all of you guys kind of ran or run in the same circle, or at least to me you do because sort of Eleanor is the bridge, but like you and Eleanor and Chris Wright all kind of feel on a similar page to me.
Wow.
In that you're doing these comics that to me feel very much like really good literature. And that's not to say that the art isn't spectacular on all three of yours, but a lot of times sort of more artsy or indie leaning comics people will put the energy more so into the art than into the narrative. And I think that all three of you kind of put narrative at the forefront.
I think I've become this like really anxious 7-year-old when it comes to my likes, and so when I see a book that just looks really nice, but like the dialogue or the story doesn't ring true or seems really clumsy, I'm like in this like, no, tell me a story, kind of way. And so when I see a book that I used to really hate when people used to use the word art comics because I think like, well, comics are art, they're wonderful, but when I do see like a giant 300-page book of just things that look nice, but it's got this kind of pseudo-mystical thing going on where it just looks like neat doodlings and pinups, and it doesn't really tell a story, I get really kind of anxious and kind of like wanting more.
I'm in the same boat.
Right. And I don't begrudge those, and I also realize like maybe I'm just 38 and that's not for me,
Yeah. Well, I think that there's definitely something that you're doing that really resonates with me, and I think that you are my favorite short form comic maker. And it's because the stories they feel to me always incredibly earnest. Like you never seem like they always feel like you're believing in the story that you're telling, but the stories that you're telling are absurd but treated with a lot of concrete grounding. So it's sort of it feels almost the way that you have the logical disconnect of a dream where, okay, well, this is my house, but it's really a Wendy's, and my third grade teacher is there, or I know she's my third grade teacher, but in the dream she's a bear, or whatever it might be. And your stories.
Some of it's definitely autobiographical. I mean, there's definitely a lot of autobiographical stuff thrown in there, and in some ways, I do kind of sneak that stuff in. But I know the times that I've done straight up autobiographical comics, they seem kind of, like I'm not really happy with them. And so when I try to put those elements into like a weirder fictional stories with like dream-inspired stuff or surrealism, then I feel a bit more comfortable putting in those autobiographical elements mixed in with fiction. So
Well, they read. The thing is, they never read like they shouldn't matter. Everything is told in a way that this is how the world of the story works. And I'm saying this mostly just because the Grizzly felt like that, and I don't think that's necessarily the case with all of them. But Weekend at the Atwood was one of my favorite comics that I'd read that year. Same with Sometimes I Think About You at Night. Like they're just both just such amazingly well done short stories. And I'd hold them up with alongside any comics or prose short stories that came out that year as being among the tops. Just because they were just really well executed in every capacity.
gosh,
But I bring this up because a lot of times you do these kind of McSweeney-esque short fiction, and then Cold Crew is very much a genre story, and
yeah,
it feels like it kind of falls into the category of what you read a little more cleanly than the
sure.
stuff that you usually do.
I've been talking to like I liked Ridge's comics a lot, and when he started coming down for Fluke and would come down to visit Joey and Drew, he would he said, "Oh, I like your comics." And when someone like that who does the kind of crime and horror stuff that he does says, "Hey, do you want to?" he started publishing the Recoil books
Mm-hmm.
himself, so which is like all of his stuff in that same universe of books, but him publishing it himself. He said, "Would you like to do one of those books?" I mean,
Now,
we should.
Recoil. Before you continue, if
Oh,
anybody is
sure.
unfamiliar, Recoil is a line of comics that Rich Tommaso has put together. That um, it's crime, horror, and suspense.
Correct.
Is it crime, horror, and suspense, or crime, horror, suspense?
I think it's like
As in
crime, horror,
all
suspense.
elements must be
Like I feel
present.
like a little slash, like I think like each thing has a little backslash between them and so forth.
Okay,
And so
it's
he
not an
said,
algebraic equation for what
no,
you're going to find in each individual book.
that- so yeah, he asked me, would you like to do a book under that Recoil imprint? I was just like really taken aback, like, wow, yeah, I would, because when he and I started talking about horror and crime stuff, we're both, crime fans. We're both, for everything from like, like all the Westlake stuff, and Jim Thompson, and then, but at the same time, like, all the nice pulpy horror stuff, like 70s horror comics,
Mm-hmm.
and so he and I are like on the same wavelength, and so I thought, yeah, I do want to do a crime comic, but but I also want to do a horror comic. And I saw a comic from the early '50s called Monster Crime, and the cover has like what looks like a guy the way he's dressed, I can't tell if he's like a policeman or if he's like a milk salesman or a delivery guy. Like he's carrying some kind of weird case, but he's got kind of like a weird green cap on, and he's running away from like a woman with a whip and a monster and just all other kind of crazy stuff. And I was like, wow, I
Monster
bet I,
crimes. Yeah.
I bet that's the best comic book in the world right there. And I've never seen a scan of it online or anything. So I'm just, and so I thought Monster Crime. And so I thought like I've been reading some of those Dick Briefer Frankenstein comics.
Mhm.
But like I had seen some of the stories he did when it was still a straight up horror comic before it became a humor comic. So I thought, yeah, I want to do like like a standard heist goes wrong story, but I want to throw in, but I also want to do a Frankenstein comic,
Mhm.
and it was very much like a simple down pat story. I mean the story is pretty much predictable as far as like, hey, we're doing a heist. Oops, something went wrong. Like
Well, you can see things coming with it where it's like, tell such and such to get into character, and you start to you give your audience enough information to start piece together that it's
sure,
going to go
sure,
wrong, and
yeah,
but you're still compelled to see how it plays out. Like it's really that suspense in that algebraic equation you got going
sure,
on.
sure.
So
I mean, I could pretty much ruin every single Parker book by saying he gets away with it, but more or less, but not quite. And something goes wrong somewhere along the ways, and sometimes he comes away with some money, sometimes he doesn't.
yeah,
But reading everything that builds up to that is amazing.
yeah.
So
Well, the I Well, you know what? Actually, so with this, I think the thing that does connect it with your other work is that the horror elements are taken for granted by the characters.
Sure.
And that actually, I'm reading a book now that Eric Newsom recommended to me, called "The Philosophy of Horror,"
Ooh.
and it's got brilliant passages, but it's very much like an academic tome, and so
Sure.
there are long sections where it's like 4 pages, like spent defining a word using defining a term as he intends to use it in the book with the clunkiness that entails. Um, Sometimes when I read those books, I want to read a paragraph aloud to Liz just to see if she'll like pass out on the floor. It's like, um, but but one of the things that he argues in horror is that for horror to work, horror as opposed to fantasy, something that might have scary elements but is fantasy, like Harry Potter, Six Gun, or whatever it might be, or Hellboy, is that the horrific elements must seem unnatural to the characters.
Sure. Sure. I mean,
Um, and so although you use horrific elements in your work and monsters and sort of traditional Halloween tropes, um, your work rarely feels like horror to me, and I think that might be one of the criteria or one of the factors that for by which I feel that way is because it
sure.
almost feels like a magic realism type of thing, in that it's accepted that you have turkey monsters or zombies or Frankenstein's or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I kind of set most of the stories in this like fictional city area called Tragiston, where there are monsters everywhere, and I've got a very vague story leading up that may or may not be a sequel to Cold Crew that involves, that character that winds up being a Frankenstein
Yeah.
creature by the very end. The next story will be him being kind of a Frankenstein creature himself.
Hmm.
Um, I've kind of got this kind of half-hearted like idea of what if he becomes all monsters? Like he also becomes a Dracula. I mean, he also becomes a vampire. He also becomes a werewolf. He also becomes a mummy. Or he becomes he goes through all these things. Like he's just like I can't catch a break. I was a human being like a month ago.
I actually,
And
gosh, that
so,
sounds fantastic to me.
and so I've got that kind of plotted out, but
Well, it sounds fantastic to me because knowing the way that you'd handle it, you're able to carry across this very droll humor without it ever feeling like you're trying to be funny or using
sure,
exploitative ideas for their intrinsic comedic value. It's
sure.
usually just a result of how the character stuff plays out. So in my mind, it's basically like a Coen Brothers mummy movie. Um,
Well, there are certain elements of like I mean, I think in the stuff that I do is like I do like including things like with monsters and werewolves and so forth in the universes of characters just kind of being like us full moon night don't go out tonight there's werewolves out just
mhm.
seriously stay indoors. But there's something about ghosts in general and like I think ghost stories are in somewhat my favorite category of horror stories
Mhm.
because there's still something that just if you happen to run into a Frankenstein creature in real life, you're going to be like, there it is. That he's got stitches. That's kind of eerie. It's eerie and weird. But
But you get used to it pretty quick.
yeah, but ghosts, I don't think anyone ever gets used to.
Yeah.
I'm someone who lived in what I believe was a haunted house
Hmm.
in the in like the early 2000s. My brother bought a house. It was a small like little ranch house from built in like 78. It didn't look like a scary house, but the
Yeah.
house when I lived in it, it really did feel like there was someone in the back of the house all the time.
Hmm.
And not in this like horrible like oh my god, horror scary kind of way, but just it made me I was uneasy there all the time.
Yeah.
And I think I saw something there one time that made me go, "Yep, that's I saw," and and it just scared the crap out of me. But
Yeah.
and so, yeah, I really do like having certain kind of ghost elements of people still just being like, I'm not used to that.
Yeah. And And your ghost stories tend to have a lot more melancholy, I think, than your other stories. I think you tap in nicely to the inherent sadness of ghosty existence. I think Weekend at the Outwood being a good example of that. Weekend at the Outwood, and is Weekend and some of the other ones that we're mentioning, are those available for sale on your site? Can people
They
buy your
are. They are.
minis?
Yeah, Weekend at the Outwood. I think issues 11 on upwards are still in print.
Okay, and your website is
PatrickDeanComics.com, and it'll reroute you to like the blogger site.
and Patrick has a K in it.
Patrick does have a K in it, yes. It's PatrickDean.com is actually a wedding photographer. And so I always wonder how many people who used to know me in high school go to the wedding photographer website and go, oh, I guess he's doing that now.
I've got there's a Brazilian electronica musician named Chris Schweitzer, and every once in a while I'll get somebody like sending me a picture of this guy like leaning against a graffiti wall in like an all white outfit, and they're like, "Is this you?" And I'm like, "No, we have similar coloring, so it throws us off." Um, but Weekend at the Outwood is basically a ghost reunion. Everyone who's died at this particular motel. Um, and it's a sad story. It's funny. I'm
Stories, and like, anytime they start giving out like the backstory of anything involving why it's haunted, there's always like it has to involve death and tragedy, and so people
yeah
always talk about like, oh, it's a scary story about a ghost kid, and you're like, my first thought is, oh my god, that kid died a long time ago. That's terrible. As
yeah
opposed to, oh, a ghost kid, that's horrifying. I
yeah.
mean,
Well, there is something intrinsically like scary and or intrinsically sad about a lot of the scary things, and I think the most effective. Not the most. I mean, there are very different types of sort of narrative horror fear that can arise, but I think that the tragic one is usually pretty effective.
sure. I mean, there was a neat thing. I live in Watkinsville that has a very supposedly haunted downtown area, and we have a place called the Eagle Tavern Inn that dates back to like I think the late 1700s,
Mm-hmm.
where people would come around, and it was the 1700s, and so they would. It was like the only hotel in this little small town, so they would go there. Most people would die there, possibly, and so they would keep all the dead bodies in the basement until they could be buried the next day, or whenever things got warmer. And so the whole place is apparently like apparently if you're in downtown, you can apparently see figures on the second floor that's supposed to be not there. And then there's like an old jail that dates back to like the late 1800s that has actually that they say is haunted. And when you hear the story about why it's haunted, it's because there was one of the largest mass lynchings in that jail. And that's such a horrific story that people go, oh, it's a spooky story about this. I'm like, well, what happened? Oh, it's one of the biggest mass lynchings in American history. I'm like, that's awful. That's it's not
Yeah.
scary. That's just depressing and upsetting.
Yeah, I've worked at and lived in some places that are, I guess, haunted in public acclaim. I guess
Sure.
only one of which have I ever actually seen or responded to anything. But also, I don't really with a lot of with rare exception. There one time, and I think I told you that story about when I was a guard at that mental hospital.
Yeah.
Like that place kind of freaked me out at various points. But most of the time, I mean, like even if I have a nightmare or whatever it might be, and I had that thing the other day, where you, I assume it's where the succubus legends stem
Oh,
from, where
sure.
you can't, where you wake up, but that
And
chemical is still being produced that
yeah.
keeps you from like running in your sleep, and so you're incapable of moving. So I woke up, and it was probably about 30 seconds before I could move anything. Like I was actively trying to get up. But it didn't freak me out. I was just like, "Oh, that's kind of funny. I'm going to wiggle my finger. Oh, can't wiggle my finger." And so generally speaking, I'm pretty laid back, and so
Sure.
even the more sort of spooky elements of stuff, I'm just like, oh, okay, well that's kind of interesting.
I think the thing that makes that makes a horror story of that sort of thing Successful is that like as far as my interest in ghosts go, I have zero interest in anything called a ghost hunter or the ghost hunting TV shows.
Yeah,
You just don't go hunting ghosts. You know what I'm
yeah,
saying? Like ghosts find you, and so the
yeah,
idea of something kind of unsettling, kind of showing up out of the blue, and unsettling you is a lot scarier than someone saying, "Oh, we went to go hunt for ghosts. We went to a really scary building." Because I've been in like really old buildings before, and people have said are haunted that I don't feel anything, or I don't feel
yeah.
scared at, or just aren't things that look spooky. Like in college, I used to have friends that lived in houses that were like 200 years old. They would rent these
Mhm.
out, these old Adams Family style houses. I've spent the night, in these places after bars and just been like, this is a cozy little house. This is
Yeah.
kind of nice. But no, it was the 1978 ranch house on the east side of Athens that made me feel like someone was there, and it didn't look scary at all.
Yeah, I lived in this when I lived in I was in York, England, and the person that I stayed with was a colleague of my dad's, and he was the music director at the Minster there, the big cathedral, and so I was in the closest building to the Minster, to the center of town, which was really cool.
Sure,
It was built in like 1300. So I mean, it was really old, but it's always makes these like haunted tour lists. It's like number one haunted place in England,
huh?
because so many people have seen this ghost of this girl in the window, that around like sometime 1400s or something. She got the plague and her family walled her up in this room, and so that like the ghost tours stop by and things like that, and there are all these people that have cited her, but I never felt squat
Sure,
when I
sure.
was there. But when we were in that hotel, my wife and I ran a hotel that had been built in like 1840, um, and there were these two rooms that just weird stuff would happen in like all the time. The beds would get unmade. Like you'd go in, like the maid would go in, make the beds, come back out, the door would be locked, go back in, and the beds would look like they'd been slept in. It always smelled like somebody was smoking a pipe in there. The water faucets would come on their own. I mean, just all sorts of weird stuff. But it wasn't. But it was these two different rooms, and which we thought was weird until we found out, that originally they had been one room back when they were apartments for mistresses for the Elks Lodge people or
Oh,
something.
wow.
And so, but I mean, but ours wasn't like a haunted hotel. It wasn't something
Sure.
that was on any of those like haunting tours. Although there was a lot of stuff in that town that was, because it was a really old town. Um, but
My
that's
mom
the
and I.
that's the only like active encounter stuff that I ever had, and it didn't ever scare me. It was just
Sure.
irritating because you'd have to keep remaking the beds. Um,
I would probably go back into the house that in my neighborhood where my mom and I were going up there. The house was built like in like the mid '60s,
mhm.
and we went up there to feed my mom's friend's cat. They were away, and we went in there one night. We heard footsteps from upstairs, and because they were such definite footsteps, my first inclination wasn't, "Oh, it's a ghost." It was rather, "Oh, it's a burglar. I need to get the hell out of here."
Yeah.
And we called the police, and they came in and said we didn't see anything, no sign of entry. And when we told the owner about it, they said, "Yeah, we hear footsteps sometimes. That's just we hear
Yeah.
footsteps and things move around. Every once in a while, we see a weird blurry figure out of the corner of my eye. That's just the way it is."
You
And I
just
think
roll with it. Yeah.
I would go back into that house if I could. They've since moved, but it didn't. But my initial thought was, I'm going to be shot by a burglar or not. A ghost is going to scare me.
Yeah.
Which that was also fun explaining to the cop.
Yeah. Um, yep. I don't know. It's neat. I think it can, because of that nebulous aspect of them. I think they can make much scarier, sadder stories than the other stuff, which does
Sure.
kind of start to, once you acclimate yourself to the horrific elements, it stops being
Yeah.
as scary. The last half of a monster thing is, fighting the monster. Once the second half of Dracula is an adventure, whereas the first
Sure.
half is horror. And I think the second half of most horror things are an adventure. If you don't have, if once you've established, like, I think one of the big differences is how much have you established the character, and the character having a goal rather than just being. I think if the character has a fixed personality goal that needs to be overcome,
Sure.
you can almost always assume that that character is going to make it through. In
Yeah.
which case, it becomes an adventure story with horrific elements. Whereas if the character is sort of just a vague archetype, then it stays horror. And I think that's kind of sad. I wanted to do. I was trying to come up with a good horror story, um, and so I started writing one, and it kept veering towards
Adventure.
adventure
Sure.
survival story.
Sure.
And I can't break that mold without. I just can't do it.
The scariest and some of the most, I mean, the best horror comics coming out right now are all from, seems like all from Emily Carroll.
Oh yeah,
Everything she does, like the His Face All Red story.
His Face So Red was
When I was reading that online, when I
incredible.
reached
Yeah.
that very final last thing, I
Yeah.
actually did the thing where I threw my hands back and clutched my fist. Like I was thinking something was gonna like just turn around. I was like, it made me genuinely like, wow, I'm scared. That brought
I
us
think
honestly got
that's
fear in.
up there with you know. I think that's up there with like the Shirley Jackson stuff and the
Oh,
Edgar Allan Poe stuff. I think that's one of the best horror stories ever written.
yeah. Oh,
It's so good, and I in my mind, I hope I hope that she's free enough with licensing rights for it
sure.
that it will find its way into horror stories for kids anthologies in the future
Yeah.
the way that these other ones did, so that it'll become a part of the national consciousness, because it should be. It's one of those, like you've been posting these books on Facebook, like one how do you describe it, like a Halloween book a day or something?
Sure, like a horror related book, whether it's like, here's a nice 1922 anthology of horror stories to here's a Charlton horror comic that's beat up with, an awful cover. But the whole gamut of stuff I love. So
Yeah, but you've been posting these like scholastic collections of horror stories, and it's all the standard like best horror story, Monkey's Paw and whatever else.
yeah.
And to me, that His Face So Red feels like it should be in those collections in the future.
I think it was Kyle Starks and I were talking about how hard it is to make a successful horror comic because the way you have panels and you're holding a book and you're flipping around, it's really
Yeah.
hard to make the kind of pacing to make this something really terrifying. Like I remember that I think one of the as far as Hellboy being more of an adventure or fantasy thing than a horror comic, the comic he did, The Wolves of St. August
Mm-hmm.
team, Wolves of St. August, where there's the panel where um, they meet the little girl,
Mm-hmm.
Ghost, and she's like underground, and the way you flip that page over, and she's suddenly like a werewolf, but like she's kind of puffed out,
Yeah.
and like that was a really well paced thing, but it almost has to work where you're facing the page, and that page has to be on the right, and you flip
Yeah.
over the page, and then you see that.
Well, I mean, and that page turn stuff is important, and I think that's one of the really good things about the trade collections and the transition to book stuff is that the storyteller can have a lot more control over that.
Sure.
And I'll try to do that for horror. I'll put a suspensey things, like I'll put somebody, like you'll see a shadow like creeping up behind somebody on the last page, and you're like, wow, what is it? Whether or not I'm successful with it, I don't know. I'm hoping that so I'm doing the kids horror book, which is The Creeps, and it's gonna be it's a repeating cast of characters, so that ostensibly they're not gonna die.
Sure.
Although I really like, and I haven't talked to my editor about this, but I really like the idea that bad things can happen to them. So down the road, like if one of the kids, gets her spine crushed by a golem, she's in a wheelchair for the rest of the series. Like in my
Sure.
mind, I would love to do something like that, but I don't know
Kids
how well
really
that'll fly.
but I think kids like respect that sense of danger, and not everything has to be so toothless and safe. I mean, not that
Yeah.
I would. I mean, not that I would,
Well, their
let
classmates die by the handful,
oh,
so
sure,
there is
sure.
that.
My wife is reading the Harry Potter books to my 8-year-old daughter right now,
Hmm.
and she's kind of gotten used to the thing of like, well, characters are gonna die, characters you love are gonna, or even like no one is safe,
Yeah.
and I think kids, really kind of go for that and respect that versus if everyone's always safe and everyone's fine and everyone makes it through to the very end,
Yeah.
kids gonna get kind of bored by that, but when
Yeah.
you get invested in something and you realize like, oh, no one is safe, this is horrifying, wow,
Yeah. Well, that's the
then
tricky part, is trying to find how can I successfully make this scary? And I want it to be
sure,
scary while still having some funny bits, while still, like, I'm not worried about it being too scary. If anything, I would love to be too scary. I just don't know if I can successfully deliver that. I think there will be parts of it. I think part of it is that so much of the horror that we would read as a kid, even stuff intended for a kid audience, works best on the imaginative level.
sure.
The expository stuff where they're like, uh, do you read any Stephen King?
I've only read The Shining.
Okay,
That's the only book of his I've ever read.
there's a short story that he did called The Mangler, which became a not particularly great movie. But in it, there's a scene where the policeman is like, he's investigating this series of accidents that keep happening at this like hot press at a laundry, um, and he's talking like with another cop, and the other cop is saying, well, there was this one time where they, this kid was missing, and they found him in a fridge, like at the dump where he had climbed in and hadn't been able to get out. And the mom was like, no, he wouldn't have done that. It was this thing. And so, they had gotten the kid out, and the next day when the cop had come back, there were two pigeons in there. And he was like, I think the fridge was calling him in. I think some items are just bad or evil or dangerous or something.
Sure,
And it's
sure,
just this little aside to establish mood. But those are the things in horror stories that stay with me. These
sure.
little, the expository stuff that may not even relate directly to the main plot. But it's very difficult, especially when you have a fixed page count, to work that kind of stuff into a visual narrative.
Sure.
And that's the part that I'm really struggling with, is finding how can I establish some good uh, extraneous exposition without it clunking up the story, because all of it has to be delivered in dialogue, and
The most terrifying
you have to
things are
read
always
it.
like one or two little sentences where someone just says a little thing off to the side,
Yeah.
like at the very end, or like like one of the chapters ending with the Haunting of Hill House, the Shirley Jackson book
Mhm.
where it's just the whose hand was I holding
Yeah.
in chapter, and this makes you go, oh God,
Yeah.
and it's not like a huge thing, but just a little small thing, and then
Well, there's
or like
something fun about that sense of hearing a ghost story, with where or a scary story. Like that one time at I don't remember if it was at Drew and Eleanor's wedding or if it was at Fluke, when everybody was standing around by the woods, or by the edge of the yard, I should say. I
oh,
don't
that
think
was
it
a
was so
wedding,
much woods. It was at
backyard.
the wedding. But yeah, there were about like four or five of us, and we were all just telling personal anecdotes, scary stories, and we kept moving like farther and farther away from the tree line because we were just freaking ourselves out. Um, and I think that's the feeling that I want to get across, and I don't think it's going to get across anywhere in the first book, but I'm hoping the
Sure.
second book is less plot heavy. Like I intentionally left it to where the the plot itself, although it's a 122 page book, um, could probably be effectively told, or not effectively told, but it could probably be conservatively told in about 65 pages.
Sure.
And that's so that I have more time to paint the scene, establish mood, because in the first book it's 122 pages, and I think I have about 122 pages worth of plot. So like every balloon
Crucial.
is crucial. Or I think that I'm rereading it. I read it or I read the first half to Penny last night aloud because she wanted to read it, and I was like, okay. And I found all sorts of stuff that I could cut or needed to change or something like that. Nothing draws your attention to the flaws in your work like reading it aloud to your kid.
I'm on page 50 something of like a 300-page graphic novel that I'm working on right now, and stuff that I wrote about a year ago, I'll reread and go, oh, this has got to go. That's the
yeah.
That person's only asking that question just so I can explain something.
My editor's really good about calling me on that. She's like, she'll anticipatory dialogue, she'll call it.
Sure.
Where
why is that doing that there? Well, here's what
it's there so that this character can say this line. Yeah, I'm really bad about doing that, and I'm hopefully getting better. I'm also wordy. I'm hoping that I can trim down the amount of dialogue. I'll get really self-satisfied with how a sentence structure is done or a joke, and I'm not funny, so anytime I think a joke is clever, I should probably cut it. Because it's almost always not going to be funny to anybody else, and it always takes up like 60 words that I could just be trimming.
Sure. Rich Tommaso just lent me a book by George Higgins called The Friends of Eddie Coyle, and it's got some of the greatest just natural dialogue, the way everything goes along, and it's one of those things where I'm like, oh man, I'm gonna be really hard pressed not to swipe some of this style of talking, and the next time I write a book, so.
My problem is I swipe from stuff that's really wordy. So, I mean, not direct stuff, but when I'm writing a Western, like I'm thinking of Charles Portis. When I'm writing anything, I'm thinking of Charles Portis. I love Portis's dialogue more than just about anything. And it's mostly wordy. Or David Milch. I'll be thinking about like Milch would do inversion like 7 times here, and so I'll start playing with that, and it's a bad habit. But anyway, so with the troll book, so the first book is these electric Frankenfrogs. The second one is trolls, and I'm excited about doing the trolls because I think I can make them real spooky. One thing that I didn't do, where it's talking about them making things too scary, I did edit out for scariness one thing. I'd like your take on this. So in my mind, the trolls were going to use baby teeth as currency. And trolls actually are where the tooth fairy myth started. That trolls could smell out baby teeth and they would go in and get them. But then I was like, there are going to be first graders reading this who are losing their baby teeth. And I don't want them like being terrified that a troll is going to come in and like.
I would actually, as a kid, I would be like, oh, good, I'm glad my teeth are being put to good. My teeth are being used for like an entire race of creatures currency. I'm glad to contribute to their economy. I would actually be as a kid, if I had known that my baby teeth were going to be used as like a monster's currency, I would have been like, that's the best news I've heard in years.
Also, there's just something so creepy about people carrying around bags of baby teeth.
Oh, teeth, yeah. Teeth in general are something about some of the horror comics I draw. Like I like drawing certain kind of mouths and certain kind of teeth because teeth look horrifying. I have a lot of dental nightmares because I have maybe genetically just crap teeth. Where if I drink a cup of coffee, I get 20 cavities. And it's just, and I'm drinking coffee right now because teeth schmeeth. But I've had dreams where like my teeth are soft and they have like the texture of bacon and stuff, and I wake up going, oh god, my teeth are good. They're still hard. Okay,
yeah.
Teeth are scary, so I would definitely keep that in.
I think at this point I've recrafted the story so many times that it wouldn't fit.
So when I was a kid, I read that James Flora book, Grandpa's Ghost Stories. That involves, it's just one sentence where he's watching TV involving like a ghoul channel, And there's a cooking show with a ghost that mentioned. I'm sorry, a cooking show with a witch, because a ghost would be ridiculous. A cooking, a cooking show with a witch that mentions like baby toe pie or something. As a
Oh.
kid, I was like, "Oh my god!" You know, and as a kid, I'm like, "Yep, baby toe pie." I read that as an adult, like if there's baby toe pie, that means the baby's still alive? I don't know. And it just all kind of awful images pop up in my head, you know.
You don't eat a dog like that all at once. Or a pig like that all at once. That's the joke.
I think Bernie Wrightson was talking about, when you see like a cut off head somewhere, you think, yep, the person's dead because there's his head. But if you see a cut off foot,
oh, yeah. That's.
yeah, who knows where the rest of that person is? I remember Bernie Wrightson talking about that in that Masters of Comic Book Art video that came out in the late '80s, and I remember that really stuck with me. Like,
It's good. There are all these little, and that's what I'm trying to do is read more and more kind of thoughts about horror by different folks who are doing it, just so that I can get a better handle on what I'm doing and why.
I've heard the book. My brother has a copy of it. I need to read it sometime. It's Stephen King's Graveyard Shift. Is that what it was called?
Well, he did one called Dance Macabre, which is sort of which is weird. It's basically like a review book of horror from the 50s through the 80s.
Yeah.
Or through the early, it's like 1950 through 1980 or something. So it's this very like specific window of stuff that you would probably really dig. But that as a general rule, I tended to avoid for some reason for a long time. Like when I first read it, like I would read a lot of like early 20th century horror and then a lot of like post 1980 horror. But that mid period was kind of weird to me. But I'm going back and like reading all these like Richard Matheson short stories, and man, nobody writes crazy jerks like Matheson.
I really like all the antiquated stuff from like from the turn of this from the early turn of the century, where things where I picked up this book at like an Episcopal church bookstore called Ghosted by Gaslight, and it's all horror stories from like the turn of the from like the late 1800s, late 1800s or early 1900s, where things where when nighttime came, everything was scary. When nighttime came, everything was dark and oily and brown and just dark and creepy. And so at nighttime, they just brought up everyone's superstitions more. So reading that stuff from that time, it just seems a lot scarier than reading a book like from the 1980s, where it's like, and then they turn on their lamp.
Well, it's also, I think the successful 80s stuff, or the successful anything, plays into the things of its time that make it concerning. And so you have, like the 50s, I think like the big example being the Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Depending on which side of the ideological fence you're on, it's either about communist fears or it's about anti-communist fears.
Sure.
And so, but I think that the reason that stuff like that is so successful, or anything, Dracula is a fear of immigrants and mesmer.
All the Lovecraft stuff is like, this is a scary story until you start realizing how much of it is like just other immigrants.
Yeah, black people on the subway. It's pretty terrible. I think that the 80s stuff that works. I think King did a good job with this, and I think Carpenter did a really good job sort of playing up the parts of the time that lent themselves well towards scary. What's scary about the world in which we live that can be translated into an allegorical monster?
Yeah. I thought The Shining was spooky, but some of the elements that made me unnerved most was, here's a good guy, but if he gets a little bit of alcohol in him, he turns into a furious monster who hits his kid.
Yeah.
Like that was just a part that made me go, oh God. And you really, the Shining movie's okay, but it didn't really quite get into the whole thing with this guy's past with like domestic abuse and how horrified he is at it, and just how scared he is at like, the idea of like, I don't want to hit my kid. That's awful. That's the terrible thing to do, but get a drink in me and I'm that monster all of a sudden, So I think that was the more, Have you seen the things that scared me as an adult though were the things where like I remember my brother and I saw the Blair Witch Project, before it came to the theaters because I knew someone in Athens who had a copy of one of the actual VHS copies that you would see
Hmm.
on bus stops in Los Angeles. One of his friends sent him one of those videotapes that have you put it in your VCR, it immediately goes to the movie.
Hmm.
And my brother and I watched that, and he'd gone camping a lot. So the part that scared me the most of that movie was just the idea of someone being lost in the woods.
Yeah.
You know, and then by the time the movie was over, I was kind of like, that was okay. But the sentence in that movie that made me want to turn my lights back on that night was the scene at the very beginning where a guy's saying, "Oh, I remember seeing the witch in the middle in broad daylight when I was a kid. She was wearing nothing but a robe, and when she opened her robe, she had like her body was covered up in black horsehair, and she floated above the ground around the trees." And as an adult, I remember thinking about that sentence at night, being like, "That's kind of spooky." And actually, as an adult, I turned my lights back on and like read comics. So like
Yeah.
at 2 morning because I was like, that's pretty successful. If not the visuals, but just that guy's recounting of that
That's the thing. That's where horror succeeds. Is not the stuff that we see, but the stuff that
is implied.
is implied and is told. You know, the parts and the thing that I mean, I assume there's going to be other versions of this as we go along,
Sure.
but the thing that always got me in kid horror when I was a youngster was the microfilm scenes. You know,
Oh yeah.
when kids are looking at a microfilm and they see that they go back to like a picture from the 1920s and they see that their teacher is standing in the background, you know, or whatever it might be, you know.
Yeah.
Like that's the stuff that would always really get me, much more so than any actual monsters, was researching the monsters. And that's why I got into Lovecraft when I first started reading it, is because that's all that is. It's basically just dudes looking at papers and freaking out. um,
There's a book by there's a short story by Algernon Blackwood, The Willows, that he said was a big influence from 1907, and it's about atmospheric, I guess, location horror, where they're describing like a really beautiful outdoor area, in like in the Algiers area of like with this river and these willows, these little small sandy little islands, and it's a wonderful, scary story because at some point they just realize that there's some kind of weird interdimensional thing going on where there's these beings that you just really can't quite focus on, but then they describe things like things missing from the area, and again they're describing this beautiful atmosphere and this beautiful broad daylight area over there in the middle of Europe, but then they describe things like they hear a weird gonging noise, like just a weird gong noise that's like coming from somewhere, and it's just the book is just the story is horrifying, but
I
really
haven't read that one. I actually haven't read any Blackwood. I'll have to read that. I'm making my way through some of the different people. Like I read a bunch of like the William Hope Hodgson
yeah.
sea horror stories. If you've ever read any of those,
Oh
they're pretty fun. Like Ghost Pirates. Is that?
yeah.
I mean, like they have terrible titles like Ghost Pirates. It might be Ghost Ship, but I think it's Ghost Pirates. But I mean, like, but it's sort of for that same reason. Like it's creepy because even though it's older, you know, I mean, it's probably from the 20s or something. It's like, are these ghosts? Are these something from another dimension? Like we don't
Right.
really know what it is, but people are disappearing and stuff, you know. And then yeah, Eric
Yep.
Newsom sent me a thing, the John the Balladeer stories by Manly Wade Wellman, which I think is maybe the best name anybody's ever had. Manly Wade Wellman.
Wow.
But I think that I think they're like Appalachian ghost. I think it's like, in my mind, I don't know anything about it, but in my mind, it's basically John Denver Ghost Fighter. Um, which I hope that's what it is. I don't really know, but but I think it's like North Carolina. I think it's like a music, like a folklore and music person,
Sure.
goes to like the Appalachian Mountains, and I think each one is a ghost story. So I'm looking forward to reading that. That's next on my list. Um, but no, that Blackwood one sounds good. I'll give that a whirl. So you mentioned I know you've got to go, right? It's about time for you to.
Yeah, my wife's gonna be home in a little bit, and I should be making lunch and getting the house tidied up.
Okie doke. Well, I will let you go, Patrick, and I would love to talk to you again
Sure, sure.
at some point, because I'd like to talk about your comics background a little bit, and then also you working on a longer book, which I didn't know, which I think is cool. But thank you so much for taking the
Thank you.
time to
And I want
do
to be
this chat.
I want to be emailing you a list of really good ghost stories to read, and also a picture of that sweater.
Oh yeah, please do. Thank you, sir. If anybody has not read Patrick Dean's stuff, which is fantastic, I think I liked that Tom Spurgeon of the Comics Reporter not too long ago posted up a thing that was basically saying, please stop sending me Patrick Dean comics, everybody. I'm aware of how great they are.
I knew that people were sending that stuff to me until you mentioned that on there and in public at Heroes Con. I always feel like when like you get mentioned by Tom Spurgeon, Rich and I joke that it's like being you just got mentioned by the mayor of comics.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty much what it is. But yeah, I mean, it's your
because I feel like only like a dozen people. I feel like I have exactly like a dozen fans, and so.
But the thing is, I think that your dozen fans are all big shot comics people that have that, and I think it's because you hang out with comics people. I feel like anybody who is not a part of your wider audience is really missing out. So I hope that they'll go and check out your stuff at Patrick Dean Comics.
PatrickDeanComics.com, yeah,
and you spell comics the right way, not the hippie.
Oh yes,
way, right?
not with an X.
Okay, all right. Well, good. Well, Patrick, thank you again so very, very much.
Thank you,
and thanks everybody for listening.